And it is because kind of, I'm going to mention this again, the aspirations that they wanted to be a slave owner if they could. But I think moreover, they feared emancipation. They're part of that pro-slavery ideology that thinks if the slaves are freed, this is going to be bad, you know. Slave rebellion, slaves, former slaves, of course, raping white women, or simply becoming competitors are a problem for the free whites, you know. So even though they didn't own slaves, they supported slavery. And that's critical because they're going to fight and they're going to die in the Civil War. If they didn't care, didn't support slavery, I don't think you know, you're not going to have a Confederacy. You're not going to have anyone to fight that battle. And these are the guys who are going to fight, and they're the ones who are going to die. And they're going to fight and die primarily for the Southern elite. And so who I want to tell you about are, I'm just going to call them the planters. The planters were the classic statement of the Southern elite, the elite of the Old South, okay? And I do want you guys to know that the planter is indeed a potential identification for the final exam. So I need to have you understand something about the planters. I've already written on here, of course, that they were the Southern elite. They are the dominant element as far as the Southern society was concerned. And in many ways, you know, the fundamental issue is that the Civil War, we fought for them to sustain their way of life and their position as far as the society is concerned. So let me tell you all I can about the planter class. Now, the foundation of the planter class was their economic position, and that's sort of the way it always is in America. You know, you're going to create your position in the society through your economic position. So the reality is that the Southern planters dominated the Southern economy in no uncertain terms. And I've given you kind of the base foundation of their domination. They were large landowners generally, so on average the planters would own around 500 acres, and many of them had much more than that, okay? So that's just kind of an average as far as the planters are concerned. Intriguingly though, we do not define the planter by their land ownership. So there could be a large landowner in the South who wasn't necessarily a planter. The planters are defined by their ownership of slaves. Slaves is the critical factor here in terms of being a member of the planter class. Now, historians have decided to come up with this notion that I'm not sure they adhere to it quite as much anymore. But in the good old days, you know, you had to have 20 slaves to be a planter, which always made me wonder, okay, what about the guy that owns 19 or something like that, or 18? Anyway, the 20 slaves is like the minimum kind of, and don't go with that one. The average planter owned 50 slaves, so that's the number I think is more germane. These guys own a significant number of slaves. I came across a planter in Mississippi, but also had plantations in Louisiana. He owned like 2,500 slaves. He had to be one of the richest men in America. Just this massive slaveholding over multiple plantations scattered across Mississippi and Louisiana. But you know, the foundation of the wealth of these individuals is much not. It is land, clearly, but it's more the slaves. The slaves are the critical factor. And so here's the thing, because they own the land and they own the slaves, they grow the cotton. So they are the economically dominant element as far as the old South society is concerned. This is would position them, of course, to do the other things they're going to do. The planters also did dominate politics, but in the classic kind of American way. So I don't know if you guys know, but the vast majority of our elected officials are relatively wealthy people. I mean, if you look at the Senate, you see a bunch of millionaires there, and you know, it's understandable to a degree, right? You have to have wealth kind of to position yourself to be able to run for politics, to generate the campaign funding, and all the things that kind of become important there. It's not that you can't be a politician, you can't be a government official, you know, and come from the middle class. You can, but you know, the struggle increases in a dramatic kind of way. The less money you have, the less foundation you have. So, you know, it sort of works the way that, you know, those people that are relatively wealthy are the people we tend to, who can get their name out there and can be ultimately become elected. So it's not exactly this is uncommon. Now, the planters, of course, were the well-positioned people. It was so much easier for them to establish themselves in terms of the campaigns. They had more money. Their names were better known, of course, and they ultimately do become increasingly the primary element you will see as far as elected officials are concerned. I must tell you this, though, and this is always critical. It's the same way it is today. Politicians cannot represent elites. I mean, if any person would run for whatever, including president, said, "Well, I'm here to represent the millionaires," you know, right away we're not going to vote for that person, right? So the planters always had to pay attention to the well-being of the middle-class farmers. You know, they're going to speak to those people as much as they possibly can to gain their attention, to gain their support. We have found that the politicians in the South tended to have fewer slaves than the average slaveholder. So that means that, even there, they're looking for like a planter, but a planter who's not necessarily quite as rich as. It's always hard for the middle class to. I think it's impossible for me to ever want to vote for a billionaire, to be honest with you. But clearly there are people who are more than willing to vote for a billionaire. But they want people that are more kind of reflective of them and their position. So, but still, the base point is I think, Jermaine, that planters really do dominate the political situation as far as the Old South is concerned. Now, finally, and this is the thing that they are most known for, they dominate the society, just the basic social activities and social norms of the Old South society. The planters were one of the few groups that in a very self-conscious way aspired to aristocracy. Now, aristocracy is, of course, basically a European concept, of course. The word itself means the best. It's the rule of the best. And so the elites, of course, of Europe had established themselves and separated themselves from everybody else. And in Europe, prior to, let's say, the French Revolution, this was a legal status. And if you were an aristocrat, of course, you had certain rights, and the lower classes had much less in way of rights. The aristocrats would, have leisure time to play games. And I just recently read that in England, it was against the law for like some of the lower class people to play, like card games of certain kinds that were pretty much reserved for the elites. Amazingly, these were only things for the wealthy to do. But you can't have a legal aristocracy in the United States, but it doesn't mean you can't aspire to it. And the Southerners just had this sort of notion that the planters had this notion that was the way to be and that was the way to live. So we see them, kind of playing out this role of being the Southern aristocracy. We see it in their homes, and of course the classic ideal type was the Southern mansion. The vast majority of planters did not live in mansions. They lived in big houses, but the mansion, of course, was only for those who had the wherewithal to put it all together. But there are, hundreds of these Southern mansions, and they're kind of one of the fun things to do if you travel across the South. I went to Natchez, Mississippi, and Natchez is sort of known as a center of antebellum wealth and has a whole bunch of plantation mansions that you can go and you can visit. And, I'm not a fan of the plantation, but I'm intrigued by history, so I would go there. I have to tell you about this one time. It's a classic way that it happens in the South. So you go to the mansion, beautiful big mansion, big house, kind of neoclassical style, something like that. And this old lady is the docent, and she's dressed up like a Southern belle, and she's taking us on a tour. And she's telling us all about the activities that would have taken place in the mansion and this and that and everything. And she kept saying that the servants did this and the servants did that. And, I'm sorry, but I couldn't take it after a while. And I said, ma'am, you keep telling us about the servants. Where were the slaves? That's what we're talking about, the slaves, of course. And because I said that I was kicked off the tour, but I thought again it was worth it, just to put my little 2 cents in that situation. But one manifestation of the planter class were the home, the fine homes that they had. They often, like the aristocrats of old, believed in fashion. So where the Northerners are dressing increasingly, especially the men, are dressing like businessmen, the Southern planter really wanted to express themselves through their clothing. Routinely, like in the North, you're wearing the gray suit or something like that. In the South, pastels, yellows and blues, powder blues and powder yellows, aware of the latest Paris fashions for men and showing themselves in those fashions. And that was really important for them. And I really do think that for the United States, at least, I believe it's the Southerners who invented the concept of the trophy wife. And of course, in the South, it was called the Southern belle. A woman renowned for her beauty, a woman renowned for her clothing, of course. And here's the planter, of course, and he's all dressed to the nines. And here comes his wife, of course, and she's beautiful. And the expression of the Southern belle. There's been the books of study, of course, the dynamic of some Southern womanhood and the status of the Southern belle. And one of the things that I've thought is intriguing is that they portray that woman as a woman on a pedestal. So the woman is placed up on a pedestal, to be admired by all. But I always think, make that real. So she's a real woman on a real pedestal, and here she is, of course, wearing a corset, maybe a bustle. She's got a hoop skirt. And she's standing on a pedestal, and she can't even see her own feet. And clearly, that would be an anxiety. It'd be a difficult situation, And here she is supposed to be so beautiful on the one hand, but she's also experiencing unencumbered fecundity, having baby after baby, and she's having to oversee the domestic staff in terms of the plantation. It was a tough road to hoe as far as the Southern belles. But the fact that they were these sort of trophy wives is a suggestion, of course, of this expression of aristocracy. Now, the planters did work hard, but they wanted to at least express a life of leisure. That's what the aristocrats did. Whenever you watch it, or read about a Jane Austen book or something, or see a movie from Jane, you got these aristocrats just sitting around all the time, playing games. The whole day seems to be spent like dressing up for dinner, dressing up for lunch, or something like that. leisure time activities were an expression of wealth. You don't have to work hard. The planters often did have to work hard, but they wanted to at least appear to be kind of focused on their leisure time activities. And that meant, of course, that they loved to party, and there was nothing better than be a hospitable host and invite the entire neighborhood into your party. That becomes part of it. They liked fox hunting; those are leisure time activity. They liked horse racing, of course. They liked shooting. All these things that were kind of expressions of the aristocratic situation. I made a mistake one time, and I said that the planters like to have big balls. Of course, that could be interpreted however you want to do it. But what I meant was that they like to have, big dances, where all the people would come into town. That first time I made a mistake, I said they had big, like big balls. And then from that time on, I've told everyone that I made that mistake. I don't know why. I guess I'm trying to just squeeze as many laughs out of that one as I possibly can. But they like to have, all these dances and everything. So, they aspired to live lives of the aristocracy, or that mirrored their understanding of the aristocracy. And then here's one last kind of suggestion of this aristocratic ethos. So the Southern gentleman was tremendously polite. These planter gentlemen were very polite. But they were polite to you even when you insulted them, So let's say something that happened at one of these dances or something like that, and one young man was offended by another young man, and he would walk up to the other guy and he would say, "Sir, you have insulted," really politely, and take his gloves, of course, and then slap the guy in the face, and they would challenge them to the code duello. So the code duello, of course, is the duel. And dueling was a phenomenon, of course, not just of the South, but the United States. At some point, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr duked it out, of course, dueled up in New York in the early national period. But it was more of a Southern phenomenon because it reflected this sort of aristocratic attitude. And so that meant, if one guy insulted another, he would challenge them to a duel. They would routinely have dueling pistols. I always think that's so interesting. Like grandma gave the guy her grandson a set of dueling pistols that are just so beautiful and everything like that. And good way to die and all that kind of stuff. And they would have their dueling pistols, of course, and they would have their seconds, and they would meet at dawn, and they would take their paces out, and they would turn, and they would fire. And sometimes it was more symbolic, throw away your shot kind of idea, as they say in Hamilton. Other times they were in dread earnest and trying to kill the guy, right? And I have to tell you, many, many times people were killed, including sometimes both participants are killed in the duel. But this is a classic expression of an aristocratic ethos. It kind of shows us the dynamics of it. Anyway, the planter class was the dominant elite. It was the elite of the Old South, of course. And I think the most important point I'm trying to make is that the Civil War is fought for them. It's fought to preserve their way of life. And the irony is, of course, the Civil War will bring that way of life to the ground. And there's remnants of the planter class in the aftermath, but really, the status that it had, the role that it had, begins to disintegrate in the face of the Civil War. Now, whenever you discuss a class structure, you're suggesting division, okay? So we've got poor whites down here, we've got the middle-class farmers, we've got the planters up at the very top. And then, in the North, you would look at the class divisions, and there would be divisions, and there, it'd be kind of like, people going their own different direction and conflicts between classes. But because of the unique nature of the South and their desire for kind of unique and consistent desire for stability, we don't have a society that's really divided harshly, but rather one that kind of bonds together. So I can never remember, centrifugal pushing everything apart, centrifugal bringing it all together. But whatever one is correct there. What we see in the South are kind of like these bonds of society. The forces and notions tended to drive the white South together, not tear them apart, but drive them together. So this becomes another kind of unique component of the Old South society. So I want to just suggest to you that there were certain things that bonded them together in unique ways. Now, one thing that bonded them together clearly was simply the families. And it is intriguing to me that if we look at the South, we find that the Southerners have a sort of a greater focus on the family even today, and some of the greatest family reunions are in the South, and there tend to be more family reunions in the South. But the family generally, and family ties were critical to the bonds of society. And one of the primary reasons I mention this is because no matter within any given family, let's say it that way, you would have members of every single level of the Southern society. And by the way, if you check the DNA, they're all related to the slaves too, okay? That's going to cross the whole way down there. But in every single family, the vast majority would probably be middle-class farmers. They would have, Cousin Fred, the poor black sheep, poor white trash guy that's part of the family, and Uncle Joe, who's a planter, so they're all linked. So only 25% of Southerners own slaves, but I bet you get close to 100% of white Southerners who are related to someone who owns slaves. So the family ties that begin to, just are these connections essentially that will And I'm just realizing I'm using the wrong card here, family ties, that will connect all the families together. So it becomes a critical part of the Old South society. Southerners were also bound together by shared aspirations. In the North, there were hundreds of things that you might want to do over the course of your life. In the South, there's pretty much one thing that you want to do. If you're a white male in the South, you want to grow up, the aspiration is to grow up to be a planter, grow cotton, own slaves. I mean, that's it. That was the shared aspiration. The aspiration, I should say. It's not like there's a million different things you can do in the South. So since everyone pretty much is aspiring towards the same thing, and of course there are outliers and others that are doing, but it's the vast majority are aspiring to the essential Southern expression to be a planter, to own slaves, to grow cotton. So this, is bonding everyone together. Now clearly, it almost could go unsaid, a shared racism. The Southerners often didn't even talk about that issue. For them to discuss, the issue of racism, like, discussing the sun or something like that, it just simply is the way it is. And the only time they really defended themselves in this particular area was when they had to talk to Northerners, when Northerners were bugging them about the situation. By the time you get to the 1850s, the Southerners have come up with their pro-slavery ideology, and that says, what it says basically is that not only is slavery okay, the original understanding of slavery and the original foundation, validation of race, original reason for racism, now they're saying that slavery is a positive good. It's good for the African, it brings them out of Africa, teaches them civilization, Christianity, good work habits. They live in crude comfort. They're generally happy sambos, etc. And it's good, of course, for the white population. So Southerners really don't even talk about their notions of racism. They're very racist because they don't have to. They just are all in a consensus, in agreement over this particular situation. So here's something that bonds them together too. And then finally, they simply shared a number of shared values. These are just things that they believed in, that they saw were the essential manifestations of their society, of their culture. And here's where I was supposed to hold up the family. The bonds of society are, of course, the family ties, but the value is the family general. And Southerners just really believed in family and saw it as critical. And, blood was always thicker than water. And you would kill for family. It was, if someone offended your family, they're quick to defend themselves and defend themselves in a fairly violent kind of way. Family was paramount as far as they were concerned. And this is uniform across society, including the slaves. The slaves really, truly believed in the family. Their only problem was it was harder for them to sustain the family. We have a shared value in terms of religion. There's quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of religion in the North. There are different religions. South was kind of uniform in this regard. So there are some Catholics in Maryland, and there would have been some Catholics in Louisiana and, of course, in Texas. But by and large, I actually came across a book that was The Jews of Antebellum, Mississippi. And it was written by a rabbi that happened to know my aunt. And so I just did a little interesting connection there. But I think that book said that there were like 64 Jews in Antebellum, Mississippi, out of a population of around 500,000 people. Clearly there are Jews, but there aren't very many of them. Instead, what you find in Mississippi throughout the South is the vast majority of the people are Protestants, and not just Protestants, they come from two particular Protestant denominations. And the great Protestant denominations of the South are, number one, guess. Yes, indeed, Southern Baptists, and number two, guess again, Southern Methodists. You're right, And believe it or not, those two groups can have problems with each other. It's the kind of thing like I have no idea what the conflict would be about. But you have this kind of dominant perspective of Protestant Christianity that again forms a bond. And by the way, that one crosses race lines too, right? So the slaves are going to be Southern Protestants. They're going to be Southern Baptists, Southern Methodists also, okay? And here's another kind of unique bond of society, and I'm going to call it a sense of honor, or the concept of honor. Southerners were fairly violent with each other. It's just, in many ways, I do think it is just, it's the trickle down of the aristocratic ethos of the elite. So in the North, if someone insulted you, there's a number of things you could do. You could use your dignity, and so that means you don't deign to even recognize that. I don't have to listen to you. Or if you feel insulted enough, you could sue the person. You could do that. Okay, sue them for libel for what they had to say. In the South, the notion was that that's not the way you respond to this, right? If somebody insults you, you respond with violence. That's the way. It's like every Southern man is walking around with a chip on his shoulder. And the second anyone tries to knock that chip off, of course, they're going to have to respond in a violent way, basically. Now, depending on your class level, that's going to dictate the response. So for the poor whites, it's just, grab each other, and you read this stuff and it's almost hard to believe, but bite people's noses off, pull their eyeballs out and stuff like that. There were even guys who were renowned for their fighting like this, and they grew their fingernails long so that they could stab them in there and grab the eyeball out. This was the way the poor people would kind of respond. For the middle class, grab the axe, grab the whatever you have, and then of course for the planters, it's all going to be stylized in the code duello, 20 paces, turn and fire, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, this notion of honor just was all the way through the Southern society, the Southern male society, of course. The women tended to just simply, look at it with askance, of course, and then suffer the victimhood in their associations. But Southern honor was a huge kind of issue for the South, and again, a powerful bonding experience. I do want you to know that this became a sort of a national issue, right? Because the Southerners were quick to be insulted. They got the chip on their shoulder essentially. And as you can imagine, of course, in the government, like in the Congress, there are going to be Northern abolitionists, and they're going to say things that are going to be perceived as insulting to the Southerners, and the Southerners might want to have to confront them because of that, and it will lead to this really famous incident. So Charles Sumner was the abolitionist senator from the state of Massachusetts, and he stood up in the Senate one day, and he just gave this extremely scathing speech against slavery, against the South, against South Carolina in particular, and against the senator from South Carolina. Now, that individual was an elderly man who was relatively ill and unable to respond, but his nephew's name was Preston Brooks, and Preston Brooks was a member of the House of Representatives. And Preston heard about this speech, and he decided he could not let this go. I mean, this was an affront to the honor of the South, the honor of South Carolina, the honor of his family and his relative. So he waited until the Senate was done, kind of adjourning. Charles Sumner was sitting there in his desk, and Preston Brooks approaches him and he says to him, "Mr. Sumner, I have read," I'm trying to be all Southern with you guys, "I have read your speech with as much care and impartiality as I felt was possible, but I believe you have insulted my state, insulted my relative who is aged and absent, and I'm come to punish you for it." And he takes his gutta percha cane, and I don't exactly know what that means, but I think it's the material that they use on the cane, and he starts beating the crap out of Charles Sumner. There are, illustrations of this, and Charles Sumner is down on the ground and he's bleeding from the head, and Preston Brooks is standing over ready to wail on him a couple more times, And I got to tell you, Sumner was hurt, both I think physically and emotionally. It's going to take him like a year to kind of get back on top of things. But the House of Representatives, dominated by Northerners, voted to censure Preston Brooks. That's kind of the chief punishment you can do. And so Preston Brooks, in response to the censure, simply resigned his seat. He said, "No, you can't do this to me. I'm going to just go home." He goes back to, I think it was, I can't remember, it was pardon the district in South Carolina, and they immediately reelected him. As if to say, that they appreciated what he had done. And not only that, but when he goes back to Congress, all these Southerners will send him a gift of a cane. And the cane says, beat up another abolitionist. So Northerners offended by this, of course, and the South says this is the way to behave, right? If the Northerners try to mess with us that much, then we're going to make them pay for it one way or the other. So, Southern honor will have become a foundation of national incidents, leading increasingly, of course, to the division. Here's their final bond, the bond of society for the South I want to highlight for you. Never think that the Southerners were afraid of the North. They were never afraid of the North. But I'm going to say a concern with the North. They saw the North as growing. They saw the dynamism of the North. Here's my map over here. When I look at the screen, it's over here. Put my hand up, that doesn't make any difference. But anyway, they saw the size of the North. They saw the might of the North. They saw the economic power of the North. They saw the population of the North. They felt like they were becoming the minority area of the nation, which indeed they were. And they felt that they were being surrounded kind of by a sea of the free states, which in some ways that was also happening, all right? And so this concern will lead to the situation that if it becomes untenable, pretty much agreed notion in the South, if this situation becomes untenable, then perhaps we should leave. Perhaps we should leave this union, essentially. I do believe that you have kind of two base notions here that are kind of functional. One would be, let's go leave immediately, and one, let's wait till we all leave together, kind of. There were Southern unions, there's no doubt about that, but there became an increased attitude in the South. That the North looks threatening to the well-being of the South. If the situation should become where we believe it is, it can't work anymore, then we will secede. And of course, it shows you then, you have this house divided, and the North going one way and the South going the other. And for the Southerners, that will lead them to even the contemplation of the fact that this union may have to come to an end and we may have to go our particular kind of way. And when I come back, I'm going to tell you about the sectional crisis that will then lead directly to the Civil War. And I will see you then. Take care.